Hi there, welcome back. This week we were spoiled for choice for our deep dive show for you. From the coup in South Korea to half a dozen Indian origin names in the Trump appointments for his administration. From the turn of events in Syria to the situation in Bangladesh. From the United States deep state going after the Adani group, perhaps after India's increasing autonomy itself, to the Shia-Sunni strife in Pakistan that has claimed over 100 lives. There was a lot that happened. Last week, in the context of Muslim politics, I did some analysis of the Sambhal violence in Uttar Pradesh surrounding yet another temple-mosque dispute. Let's understand one very important aspect of law connected with the issue in this edition. The Places of Worship Act 1991, why it is making headlines, and how it guides many similar cases in the country. 2. We shall revisit Bangladesh in the light of the very openly hostile attitude the usurper regime of Muhammad Yunus has taken against the persecuted Hindu minority in the country. Being a client state of the United States is one thing, but turning a nation into a terrorist state is yet another. How far can this be allowed to go? And finally, a glimpse of the coming trade war with Trump takeover of the United States. This episode, the focus is on America's de-dollarization bugbear. Let's get going. Last week, I delved into the Sambhal violence centered around a court-ordered survey of the disputed Jama Masjid in town, which is claimed as an ancient temple by the Hindus. The dispute has escalated since then and has reached the Allahabad High Court via the Supreme Court. I also took a very clear position that what RSS Chief Mohan Bhagwat has said about not looking for a shivling in every mosque is a good formula to maintain communal peace and harmony in the country, and that some of the activists on the Hindu side are in breach of that understanding. But what is this Places of Worship Act which these activists have been bandying around? While parts of it are being used as a shield for their renewed cases, there's a strong demand to scrap it altogether. Passed in 1991 in times of tumult, when the nation was in throes of the Ayodhya movement, the act, on the face of it, blocks any new temple-mosque disputes. The Supreme Court, in its 2019 Ayodhya verdict, observed that the state had, through this law, carried out its constitutional obligations to uphold secularism and the equality of all religions. In effect, the Places of Worship Act epitomizes the assertion of India as a secular state. It is a sign of those secular times that the then Congress government under Narasimha Rao brought in this law, that L.K. Advani had to forego his leadership claims in favor of Vajpayee and also call it a dark day of his political life. Vajpayee, of course, absented himself from the site on December 6, 1992. On the face of it, the Places of Worship Act shut all but Ayodhya dispute from the temple-mosque claims. But there's a different reading of the law. Subsection 3 of Clause 4 provides for exceptions to the rule, which excludes ASI-protected monuments from the Act and leaves some discretion with the courts to decide upon existing disputes if they predate commencement of the 1991 law. Also, in the Gyanvapi judgment of 2022, the Supreme Court itself reopened the possibilities of other disputes, with the bench headed by then Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud observing that while the 1991 law barred changing the character of a place of worship, the ascertainment of a religious character of a place itself may not necessarily fall foul of the Act. This has led to a spate of civil suits from the Krishna Janmabhoomi in Mathura last year to Sambhal now, seeking to open temple-mosque disputes bypassing the Places of Worship Act. This, even as there are a bunch of petitions with the Supreme Court challenging the very constitutional validity of the Act itself. From the Muslim side, there are petitions seeking a stricter enforcement of Places of Worship Act clubbed together by the Apex Court, even as a response is awaited from the center. But these are legalities. The Ayodhya dispute took 3/4 of a century through various courts to reach a conclusion. The Gyanvapi or the Mathura cases might take a similar time. We don't know. But I wonder if we are dealing with a legal issue here. I chanced upon an incisive piece in an online magazine called The Print, whose author goes by the pseudonym Ibn Khaldun Bharti. Picking up on the Sambhal issue, the crux of Khaldun Bharti's argument is that Muslim denialism of medieval destruction of Hindu temples by Islamic hordes and empires impedes a sense of closure on the disputed sites. That, forget about regret or remorse, Muslim historical accounts or chronicles take great pride in the blow to the civilizational heritage of India. That modern Muslim scholarship is devoid of any introspection on this front. And finally, that getting clinching evidence and proving it in a court of law might not still assuage sentiments on both the sides. The only way a closure can come to these temple disputes, according to Khaldun Bharti, is if there's a mea culpa by Indian Muslims on that uncomfortable part of the history of Islamic rule in India, and then a correction that rehabilitates Hindu sentiments. It's a long shot. It might never happen. I wonder if the columnist uses a pseudonym and not his real name, because his arguments might qualify him for a flogging, if not outright lynching, on the Muslim street. I would still recommend a read for you all. While going through it, I was left wondering, where is the Muslim intellectual in all this? Where is the Muslim educated elite? Why the Muslim street preferred Irfan Habib over KK Muhammad on Ayodhya? Why the Muslim street jettisoned Hamid Dalwai and laps up Asaduddin Owaisi? Why the Muslim street in India sided with the ulema and not with Kemal Ataturk in 1920? Why the Muslim intellect does not revolt at the argument that Gandhi had to support Khilafat partly to mobilize the Muslim street in favor of the freedom struggle, which otherwise it was not? Why the Muslim intellectual left Shah Bano to fend for herself as she faced a legal flogging on the Muslim street? Why did the Muslim educated elite abandon reason when the Muslim street twisted and misread even basic English of the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2020? It was as if the Muslim intellectual suffered from a Stockholm syndrome. Nothing changed over a century from Khilafat to the CAA protests. Secularism was a contract that India of Gandhi and Nehru promised to the Muslims who chose to stay back despite voting for Pakistan with both hands in 1946-47. Nehru, the presiding deity of secularism, was aghast, exasperated at the loss of Congress in Muslim-majority pockets of the country. And accommodating India did not mention this uncomfortable fact in its textbooks. And accommodating India let the Muslim street block reform as the code bills passed majority muster in 1955. And accommodating India is struggling to get a common civil code as the Muslim street doubles down on a Sharia way of life. The educated Muslim elite refused to act as a bulwark against the Muslim street's blows to that contract. As in the case of Khilafat and code bills and Shah Bano and CAA, so in the case of temple disputes, the Muslim educated elite is missing in action, held hostage to the denialism that Khaldun Bharti talks about, the nation of which the absent party to complete the secularism contract. Moving on. While there is a historical denialism among the Indian Muslim intelligentsia about the past, there is a present amnesia getting reflected in Bangladesh's intellectuals. The chaos intensified in the neighboring country with the arrest of ISKCON head of Bangladesh, Chinmoy Krishnadas Prabhu, last week on sedition charges. Do you know on what grounds those charges were slapped on him? Because during a protest, someone hoisted a saffron flag along with Bangladesh flag, only that the saffron flag flew a little higher, which is for sure amounts to disrespect for the national flag. There should be a law, like we have in India, to deal with disrespect to our national emblems. But going beyond that, to deny bail to the Hindu monk on procedural grounds is a clear case of vindictive spite of the usurper Yunus regime in Dhaka. When we in the Indian media raise and amplify what's happening in Bangladesh, they cry victimhood. They say Indian media is distorting and misinforming. Look at some of the phrases being used. Contrived narrative of the Indian media, reads one column. Power drunk and click driven, says another. Even though the incidents of violence shouldn't have happened at all in the first place, they were made for far worse by a belligerent Indian media, says one op-ed. This is an op-ed in the Daily Star, which is putting the onus of lawlessness in Bangladesh on Indian media. Then a rhetorical question. All attacks on minorities are totally unacceptable, while Bangladesh must work to ensure security for all. Does this justify the Indian media's portrayal of Bangladesh? They are asking us. The owner-editor of the newspaper, Mahfouz Anam, wrote on Friday, "What India is doing is refusing to acknowledge that we have the right to change our government democratically. While the regime change may not have followed the usual electoral route, which the former Prime Minister herself prevented, ironically, if she had allowed for the holding of free elections and lost, she might have at least remained in the country instead of facing the humiliation of fleeing. It was an expression of public will that elections typically reflect. It was democracy in full play." Imagine, democracy in full play. Sheikh Hasina is deposed in a violent coup on August 5. Only 3 days later, Mohammad Yunus is pulled out of his hibernation in the United States and flown down to Dhaka to take charge on August 8. And a senior journalist in Bangladesh calls it an example of democracy in full play. Same day, the Home Affairs advisor Jahangir Alam Chaudhry of the Bangladesh government blamed Indian media for spreading misinformation about his country. He said, "Indian media is an example of how a country can spread false information about another. The people of this country will unite in protesting that." At a protest in Dhaka, a senior BNP leader, Ruhul Kabir Rizvi, burnt his wife's sari as a mark of protest against India. While the ruse was boycott of Indian products and encouragement of local goods, the picture could not have been more telling. Sari is what differentiated Bangladeshi women from the salwar kameez or burqa wearing women of Pakistan. Sari is the cultural link that connects Bangladesh with the rest of Bengal. It identifies or it defines Bengaliness like the Bengali language itself. Anam, Chaudhry and Rizvi are not willing to see the problem for what it is. It is easy to blame Indian media for highlighting the distance Bangladesh has traveled from Bengali nationalism since August 5. This week also gave another marker of how dangerously Bangladesh is pivoting itself to Pakistan in a throwback to General Ziaur Rahman days. The usurper Yunus regime has tweaked rules to allow Pakistanis to get visas without any security clearances. The measure was introduced in 2019 following intelligence on Pakistani deep state's interference in Bangladeshi politics, particularly with the radical elements. A month before this, Dhaka had allowed direct cargo vessel movement from Karachi to Chittagong port. Stricter dress codes are getting implemented for women on campuses. Restrictions on shopping by women in Gopalganj town were reported this week. Bail to Chinmoy Krishnadas might be an internal matter of Bangladesh, but Talibanization of Bangladesh has been an ongoing process. The post-August 5 trajectory of events has only unchained those forces that had gained strength over the last couple of decades. For India, the developments in Bangladesh are a serious concern. We cannot sit for long and let the situation unravel. The pivoting to Pakistan, the letting free of radical forces like pro-Al-Qaeda cleric Jashimuddin Rahmani, the continued repression of minorities and women, the denialism on worsening rule of law, compromise of India's national security, all call for an intervention plan by India. Hopefully, we would see a coordinated move once the new government takes charge in Washington, D.C. Moving to America on that note, for our next deep dive after a short break. President-elect Donald Trump hit headlines early this week with his announcement that his upcoming administration would impose 100% tariffs on BRICS countries if they attempted to create a currency alternative to the US dollar. In a post that's typically Trumpist, Donald said, "The idea that the BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch is over. We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. They can go find another sucker. There is no chance that the BRICS will replace the US dollar in international trade, and any country that tries should wave goodbye to America." The threat affects us, India being part of the BRICS formation. But who's trying to replace the US dollar? Our External Affairs Minister clarified, not us.
I think you have us confused for someone else here, because we have never actively targeted the dollar. That's not part of either our economic policy or our political or our strategic policy.
Trump's outburst reflects concerns in the United States about the rest of the world moving away from the use of dollar as the preferred currency of trade. The dollar came into its own sometime after the First World War, as the USA replaced the declining British Empire as the largest economy of the world. As the chief supplier of arms, ammunition, and much else during the Second World War, the place of the American greenback as the most preferred currency of global trade was cemented. For a century since then, it has been the reserve currency of the world, giving the United States a force multiplier to muscle its superpower status. Over a period of time, the US came to use that status to manipulate its foreign relations and indeed the world order to its own designs. Controlling the nerves of global financial system and the markets, US leveraged oversized dollar dominance to impose sanctions against nations it thought were not aligned to its values, the latest example being Russia. But geoeconomic and geopolitical changes in the past 2 decades have tapered off that dollar hegemony, led by the rise of China and the shift in global trade away from the United States. The world increasingly finds itself having options. Listen to this.
Why is it necessary for us to buy things from Djibouti and pay in dollars? Why? And we are not against the US dollar. We just want to trade much more freely. Let us pay in US dollars what we are buying from the US. But what we are buying from Djibouti, let's use local currency.
This is President of Kenya, William Ruto, coming out openly for chucking out the US dollar from African trade. This was in June 2023. This year in April, Zimbabwe pivoted its currency away from the dollar, and about half a dozen countries in the African continent have been gradually shifting to greater use of their own currencies in local trade. Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Sudan, and Congo have evolved robust mechanisms to trade with each other in their own currencies, even as Ruto emphasized creating a Pan-Africa alternative to the dollar in that soundbite that went viral last year. Brazil and China have ditched the dollar in bilateral trade, as also Argentina when it came to its commodities trade with China, settling bills in the Chinese yuan. Can you see a pattern? Most of these changes have shaped up post the start of the Ukraine war in 2022. With the sanctions regime imposed by the US and its allies against Russia, many nations across the globe realized the perils of having dollar as the reserve currency in their central banks. They were simply susceptible to arm twisting and US manipulations. India, on its part, had a rupee-ruble system with Russia, as also rupee trade with Iran to begin with, both countries incidentally facing a strong sanctions regime from the United States. In fact, at last count, there are 18 nations with whom India carries out rupee-denominated trade transactions. But that still remains a minuscule part of the overall trade basket. Like in the case with Russia, we had to suspend the rupee-ruble route as Russia had a problem of plenty. It had billions of rupees through its trade with India and did not know what to do with it. One Russian investments in India do not justify that kind of rupee storage. 2. Indian rupee cannot be used globally. So that, in a way, underscores the limitations of de-dollarization in the present stage, at least. According to data from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in quarter 4 of 2024, 58.22% of the reported foreign currency reserves in the world were in the US dollar, 19.76% in euro, and the renminbi accounted for just 2.14% of global forex reserves. The corresponding figures for 2022 were 58.36, 20.47, and 2.69%, as you see in the graphics, which means that while the US dollar continues to cede ground to other currencies in global trade, the pace is slower than slow. Also, China holds roughly $4 trillion in its foreign reserves, the size of India's GDP. It is not in China's interest to bat for de-dollarization unless it wants to fast-track its own economic collapse. That leaves Russia facing the maximum brunt of the West-led financial sanctions regime for the last 2 years. Moscow has been making the loudest pitch for a dollar alternative. But even here, President Putin couches it in a lot of his smartness. Holding a media interaction in Moscow on Wednesday, Putin said they did not seek de-dollarization. It's a fait accompli America invited upon itself by seeking to alter the world order and thus making the rest respond to shield themselves from the consequent instability. Long after Trump and his bluff and bluster strategies to deal with the issue have gone, the world would have achieved substantial de-dollarization. It's a tide the United States cannot stop. Part technology, part change geopolitical map of the world would make sure it happens. On the other part of Trump's threat, the 100% tariff, I shall come to it closer to Trump's inauguration, by which time hopefully there will be more clarity on how strongly he intends to disrupt global trade. Thanks for watching.
उस दौरान ये कहा जा रहा था कि आप अजीत पवार और एक नाथ शिंदे, क्योंकि उस दिन हमने देखा जो हंसी मजाक आप लोग कर रहे थे, क्या वो पिछले कुछ दिनों में ऐसा कुछ हंसी मजाक भी हुआ कि देखिए आखिरकार शपथ ग्रहण होना है और सिर्फ अजीत पवार के साथ जो ऑल टाइम डेप्यूटी चीफ मिनिस्टर सिर्फ उनके साथ ही हो जाए? ऐसा कई सारे मीम्स भी जा रहे थे।
इतने मीम्स थे तो हम लोग तो एक दूसरे को शेयर करते थे और उसके ऊपर हंसते थे। बड़ा
एक नाथ शिंदे ने आपको वापस जवाब दिया आपके मीम के?
नहीं, हमने तो अजीत दादा को दिखाया कि एक ऐसा मीम था जिसमें अजीत दादा कुर्सी पर बैठे जिस पर उप मुख्यमंत्री लिखा है, दूसरी कुर्सी खाली है जिस पर मुख्यमंत्री लिखा है, और वो अजीत दादा कह रहे अरे भाई किसी को तो बैठाओ, मैं तो परमानेंट हूं। तो इस प्रकार कई मीम्स बने तो हम लोगों ने भी उसको एंजॉय किया।
यही एडवाइस आपने एक नाथ शिंदे जी को कहा एक रात पहले, क्योंकि कई लोग अटकलें लगा रहे थे कि ऐसा हो सकता है वो पार्टी चलाना चाहते, उप मुख्यमंत्री नहीं बनना चाहते, और फिर आप जाते हैं वर्षा बंगलो में। तो लोग ये थोड़ा जानना चाहेंगे, मैं कोई अटकलें मीडिया स्पेकुलेशन नहीं करना चाहता क्योंकि आपको वो पसंद भी नहीं है, मैं खाली जानना चाहता हूं कि आपने ऐसा क्या कह दिया जिससे अगले दिन एक नाथ शिंदे खुद स्वेरिंग इन शपथ ग्रहण के लिए आए?
मेरा उनसे व्यक्तिगत संबंध है, एक दिन पहले की बात नहीं है, 2-3 दिन पहले वो पेशोपेश में थे कि मैं क्या निर्णय करूं, क्योंकि उनके यहां एक बड़ा तबका ये मानता था कि उन्होंने सरकार में जाना चाहिए, पर एक छोटा तबका ऐसा भी था जो कहता है
South Korea's shortest ever martial law. President versus Parliament comes to an end. The only global channel live from Seoul. Watch This Is exclusive at 7 p.m. today. BJP goes all out on Congress Soros link. Is deep state backing fueling opposition's agenda?